We live in a time where we just sort of take it for granted that there's internet in buildings that we walk into. We just sort of assume anymore that if you walk into a public place or semi-public place, there will be a Wi-Fi network that you can log on to and that your devices can connect to. We don't even really ask where it comes from or have a good explanation. We just sort of assume it's there. In a weird way, that's kind of how the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, take the existence of angels kind of for granted and just sort of assume they will show up in the story. That's where our conversation starts as we get ready for this week's session in Things Seen and Unseen, our study of angels. So last week, Vicar Natalie introduced us to sort of a 101 angelology, big picture questions about angels, how they show up, what things we do know about them, what things we don't know about them in the Bible, and we left the rabbit trails for an awful lot of other questions that we'll explore over the course of the weeks in this series on angels. But where we're going to pick up this coming week for our session on Thursday is we're going to take a look at stories within the Old Testament, within the Hebrew scriptures, where angels show up. And like I say, in a way, the Bible almost starts the way we have come to just accept that there will be the internet around. We don't even really ask where it comes from. You don't start out with, I wonder where their router is, or if they have cable, or if they have through their phone line. We just sort of assume anymore that there's this invisible reality called the internet that can be used in a host of different ways, right? You can check status updates on your device. We can live stream video events at the church, or you can check your social media, send an email, order dinner, click on something on Amazon and have it sent to your house by the end of the day. The internet is this really, really versatile tool, really a set of tools, but we're used to just calling it, the internet, and we assume it's there all the time, even though it's invisible. Well, in an interesting way, the Bible sort of just opens up, as we talked last time, with stories about what we can see, right? We started with the creation story in Genesis 1 that starts with a laundry list of things that we can see and know are there. The sun and the moon and the stars and the sea and the sky. We don't get a separate story about where angels came from or when God made them or how they experience time. But by the time you get to Genesis 3, there's just, and there's these angels because they're needed for the story. So it's sort of I forgot to tell you they're angels. We're first introduced to angels, at least a particular kind of them, called cherubs or cherubim, which is the plural in Hebrew, as a consequence of the first human beings disobeying God in the garden. And as they're expelled from the garden in Eden, God, it says, places cherubim with a flaming sword to guard the entrance so nobody can get back to that garden and nobody can get access to the tree of life, right? But interestingly, we don't get any verse to stop and say, here's what a cherub is, by the way, and these are angels, and here's what they look like. We just get, there's cherubs. I sort of assumed you knew that they existed. The Bible is like that. There are times when the biblical writers sort of assume a view of the world that we might or might not automatically already share, and we sort of have to get brought up to speed. In other stories, you get figures like Abraham and Sarah who were minding their own business in their tent, and these three strangers come along, and the stranger is somehow looks like a regular person. Somehow there's three of them and sometimes only one of them speaks. Sometimes Abraham senses he's talking with God, and sometimes Abraham senses that maybe the two entourage with the one speaking for God are angelic messengers. We never get a real clear description of exactly how Abraham knows what or exactly who these figures are, other than just somehow God is present with these messengers alongside. We're going to have to get used to that kind of way of thinking if we're going to explore the way the Bible talks about angels showing up in our lives and in the stories of the scriptures. But be ready for these mysterious figures to show up in all the roles we talked about last time. Sometimes they're there as messengers bringing a message from God. Sometimes they're there in sort of a defender kind of a role. They're there to fight on behalf of God's people, to protect them when they're in harm's way. Sometimes they're there as obstacles to stop potential threats or people who are getting in the way of God's good purposes. And sometimes they're just a reminder that God God's creation is so much bigger and wilder and wider than we realize. The same way that we have come to expect the internet to be there all the time, even though you can't see it, even though you can't like grab it or hold on to it. We know it's there. The biblical writers talk about angels as part of this reality that is unseen, but from time to time shows up. The same way that from time to time you can check and see the presence of the internet when you get an incoming message or somebody sends you a meme or something like that. We're going to have to get used to the idea that we walk through a world, through a universe with an awful lot that exists that we sometimes just take for granted and assume is there, and sometimes we haven't even realized was there, waiting to be recognized all along. We're going to take a look at more stories like this throughout the Old Testament and the Hebrew Scriptures and see maybe what they might mean for our place in the world and how we live our lives of faith, and also how we understand the whole story of God and God's people in the Scripture. So join us for our next session, Thursdays at 1 o'clock. So this week on the 12th at 1 o'clock here at Community of Christ, and we'll keep offering these video summaries to get you caught up along the way too. Thanks. See you then.